So then I'm going to ask for the co-host so you can show.
It says host disabled participant screen sharing.
Give it a minute. I just did it.
Okay.
No, it says withdraw co-host permission. So
There it goes. I got it.
All right.
Whoa.
Well,
I take it away?
Yes, please.
Okay. So thank you and good evening. And let me start by introducing our ACT team for this Brick Township Flooding Solutions presentation. And this one is Beaver Dam Creek Watershed. And thank you, Mayor and Council, for letting us be here. I'm going to start by introducing the ACT team. I'm Carol Besky, the founder of ACT Engineers. And I did that 29 years ago. So I'm happy to say that ACT has a very successful history for the past 29 years and working with clients in both the public sector and in the private sector. I serve as the Director of Public Involvement and Community Outreach. Over the years, I have led hundreds of public involvement efforts on projects for municipalities, for counties, state and bi-state agencies. And they include projects that some of them under $10,000, and others projects that were over $500 million. These projects include flooding and drainage issues, bridges, tunnels, dredging, wetlands, shoreline restoration, to name just a few. And I've worked with numerous state and federal agencies in the process. And thank you to the Beaver Dam Creek Watershed area residents for joining us whenever you get to see this. Let me say, we'd rather be meeting you in person and standing next to you and talking to you, but so far the governor's orders don't allow us to do that, so we're going to make the most of this, and hopefully it will be an informative presentation for you. Now, to introduce the rest of the ACT team, Rob Korkich is a licensed professional engineer and a professional planner. He's the president of ACT Engineers and is head of the engineering efforts at ACT. Jeff Richter is a licensed professional engineer and a professional planner and is the director of engineering. Both Rob and Jeff have years of experience in flood mitigation and drainage issues, and both Rob and Jeff have served as consulting engineers as well as in-house engineers working for municipalities, counties, and state departments, as well as on federal projects. Next, I'd like to introduce Eric Racina. He's Vice President of ACT and the Principal in charge of Environmental Services and Permitting. And Janetta Dix is the Director of Environmental Services at ACT Engineers. Both Eric and Janetta are experts in their areas involving environment, and in particular in the area of environmental permitting. They both individually and collectively have very successful records in obtaining environmental permits for our clients from federal and state agencies, including the likes of NJDEP, NJDOT, New Jersey Tidelands, and the Army Corps, just to name a few again. In fact, ACT has a record of obtaining several permits for our clients that have never before been issued by either NJDEP or the Army Corps. It usually starts with the agency saying, when we first meet with them, no, that's not the way you can do it. And then Eric and Janetta go to work, and it's a lot of hard work and persistence, but we most often and almost always successfully obtain those desired permits. So we're a very persistent group. Let's go to our scope of work and just a quick little review. ACT's scope of work was to gather and review existing information and data in the designated flood-prone areas of BRIC. We were identifying flood elevations and establishing solutions for flooding based on that information. And as you know, engineering is based on data, and there's a lot of existing information available. Information from the state and federal agencies such as NJDEP with existing LIDAR, as well as the Army Corps, the Bureau of GIS, FEMA, and a lot of information with existing infrastructure from Brick Township. With that information, we're able to develop mapping of 13 designated study areas that that give us the topography, elevations, storm sewers, roadways, bulkheads, frequencies of flooding, and other pertinent infrastructure information that we need to move forward with design. Then based on all that information, we do develop and recommend a conceptual engineering solution for each of the specific flood-prone areas. And then those solutions, those concepts will be advanced to engineering, design, and then ultimately construction. So as you know, tonight's meeting, we're focusing on Beaver Dam Creek Watershed. And on this next slide, you will see the 13 study areas that we are focusing on. And on the right-hand side of the picture, you see the areas that are specifically identified for the study. And now I'm going to turn it over to Jeff, who's going to walk you through a lot of information. Jeff?
Thank you, Carol. As Carol indicated, this slide shows the 13 study areas listed on the left side of the slide. You'll notice number 4 is the Beaver Creek Dam, or Beaver Creek Watershed, which includes Bay Harbor, Baywood, Harbor Place, Island Drive, Island Court, Van Note, Glenwood Place, Swan Point, Sandy Point, Toons Brook, and Princeton Avenue, the Bayfront. Those particular neighborhoods are the subject of tonight's presentation. You'll notice on the map on the right-hand side is an aerial view of Brick Township. The areas in blue are the low-lying areas that are subject to flooding. This is a very large-scale map, so your neighborhood may not be visible from this scale. You'll also note that the yellow outlines represent the study areas, and there's a number in blue next to those that represents the name on the left side of the slide. Obviously, the numbers 4A through 4I are the Beaver Creek watershed property or study areas. Okay, now the next slide.
Sorry, I got a little ahead of you there.
Okay, this slide we want to explain, there's 2 sources of data that we use and that the neighborhood may use to look at the tide data. One is Stevens Institute of Technology and their flood advisory. This particular map is on NAVD 88. NAVD 88 is a surveyor's datum that's used, is the general datum that's used by all surveyors throughout the state. That datum is used when collecting topographic data or staking out buildings or roadways, et cetera, so that everything can be on the same datum. You have to be careful when you use this particular website to make sure that the datum is, there are several datums that you can select. This particular one is the NAVD 88. And everything we talk about tonight will be on that particular datum, NAVD 88. So we just wanted to clarify here what datum that we're using. Both of these charts are from the Manahawkin tide gauge. As I said, the one on the left is the Stevens Institute on the NAVD 88. You'll notice the other one is another one that's can be found on the internet, the NOAA gauge, which is on a gauge datum. You'll note that the Stevens Institute of Technology datum yields a peak elevation around 611 of about 1.7 or 1.76, if you will, and that the NOAA at the same time period indicates a elevation of 2.16. Well, the NOAA, any reading on a NOAA chart here you need to subtract 0.4 feet to get to the NAVD 88. So if you did that, you would come up with the same datum or the same elevation as provided on this Stevens Institute of Technology chart. So I just wanted to clarify that and mention again that all of the elevations that we're going to be talking about through the rest of the slides is going to be on the NAVD 88. Next slide. Okay, this slide shows just a graphic representation of where the tide ranges are for the Beaver Creek watershed. The mean high water, the MHW, is 1.09 feet, and the mean higher water elevation is 1.33 feet. That's the MHHW. The red lines represent the lowest elevation of stormwater structures within the Beaver Creek watershed. The lower red line is at an elevation of minus 0.79, and the upper red line is approximately minus 0.04. So you can see they're both below the mean low water elevation. And again, these are the low points of storm structures within the communities. You'll notice the gray at the top shows short-term conceptual design elevation range, which we're looking at an elevation of 1.4 to 2.0. You can see that this design elevation gets above the mean high water for all cases. Next slide. This slide shows is a representation also taken from Manahawkin tide gauge. Let me explain the elevation or the information along the bottom of the slide represents the years. So you can see it runs from 2006 to 2020. Up the left-hand side is the elevation, again at NAVD 88. That ranges from 0 up to 4. Now the blue represents the fluctuations in the tide over the course of the 17 years. You can see there are several points that project above the yellow line, which I'll describe in a moment. And you can see there's an elevation and a date associated with the majority of them. The tide gauge does not record data, and they don't release data for storms such as Sandy and hurricanes because it's not reliable data because it's beyond the range of the gauge. So those particular events are not included on here. And you'll know, I just want to point out that in the center of the slide, the highest blue line, highest tidal line, it has a peak of 3.38. And you'll notice most of them are well below that. And that'll come into, you'll understand why I'm mentioning that 3.38 in a moment. So then, based on the yellow, the upper tide elevations, we came up with the concept design elevation of 1.4 to 2.0. That would be the elevation that we would look to get to with roadways, infrastructure, et cetera. And you'll note that at the 2 elevation, there's not as many occurrences of flooding, at these higher elevations. Most of the flooding occurs at elevations below 2. Okay, but you'll note there's a gap in the data between the end of 2019 and the beginning of 2017. At this point, the gauge was down and there was no data published by the agencies. And the last thing on this particular slide, you'll notice a red line that is gradually progressing in an upward direction. And that is labeled as the average tide elevation. Based on the data from this particular tide gauge, it was noted that there's an increase of 1 3/4 inch of the average tide per decade. So that means based on those 14 years, the tide rose 1.75 inches per decade. Next slide.
That's sea level rise, right, Jeff?
No, that's the average tide elevation rise. It's probably, it's associated with sea level rise, but
Okay,
that's the average tide elevation rise at this particular tide gauge.
got it. Thank you.
Mhm. Okay, based on that data, we looked at the community flooding impact assessment. Now, one of the terms I want to define right off initially is, you'll notice the 2 tables, there's a bunch of numbers that go down on the left-hand side of each table. At the top of the column, it says number of dwellings with compromised access. So what we mean by compromised access is the dwelling that either fronts on a flooded road or needs to travel through a flooded area of a roadway to get out from their home. So that would be compromised access. So if you live in a dry area, but the only way out is to drive through a flooded roadway, you're considered a compromised access property. So having said that, you'll notice that the table on the left is our impacted with a flood elevation of less than or equal to 2 feet. And that 2 feet relates back to the yellow line that we had on one of the prior slides. And this, for this particular the elevation up to 2.0, we're looking at short-term design approaches. So you'll notice the communities in yellow are all of those that are located in the Beaver Creek watershed. And you can see they're ranked according to the number of impacted properties. Now, you'll notice on the right is the impacted properties with the flood elevation greater than 2 feet up to 3.4. And you remember there was one elevation that went up to almost 3.4 in that other flood slide. These are what we consider the long-term design approaches. And again, you'll see the properties or the neighborhoods highlighted in yellow and the corresponding number of compromised access for each of those properties also in yellow. Okay, next slide. Okay, so this slide represents is an inundation map that we prepared based upon the topography for the Bay Harbor area. The blue represents the inundation of floodwaters. The black obviously is the bay. The bay waters. It would be confusing to have that blue as well. So the blue represents water that's on top of marsh or land areas. So the blue is to an elevation of 2.0. So if we go to the next slide, you notice that Bay Harbor Boulevard has a portion of it in yellow. The yellow represents low-lying roadways. And this would be areas that are less than 2 feet, which is the flood elevation that we talked about on the prior slides. Okay, if you go to the next slide. Now this slide shows the 3.4, which again, from that prior slide, I'd indicate that it only approached that elevation one time in the last 14 years, excluding major storm events. So this is what it would look like at 3.4, which would be more of a major flooding event.
So can I interrupt for a second? So
Sure,
at our
sure.
last council meeting, Alyssa, I don't know if you watched the meetings, but George Scott, a resident of Queen Anne Road, got up to complain about persistent flooding, I guess down by the park. Oh, was that Johnny?
It's at the end of Queen Anne.
Right.
It is where while I understand the tidal gauge doesn't reflect higher than elevation 2, if you have a south wind or an east wind, a lot of these areas just get inundated with flooding in any event because it gets trapped in the head of the bay.
Right, sure.
But
Yeah,
that's not a low-lying road.
It's low. It's below elevation 2. I gave everything what was identified for the study
Can we
was
go
below
back?
elevation 2.
Can we go back?
Go to the prior slide.
If you look at the end, see how it's underwater?
Yeah,
Okay.
why didn't that should have been colored yellow as well.
Okay. All right. That's
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, the end of Queen Anne Road should be yellow as well. That's correct.
Okay. That was my question. So I would just ask before we post this, I will also post the presentation separately. So I would like to post a presentation that shows that. So Carol,
Yes.
you email me. Okay, thanks.
Got it, got it.
All right, good. Just want to make sure that was covered.
Okay,
Good
Great.
catch.
okay, go to the next one. Okay, this is the aerial, same scenario of Baywood. The orange areas on this particular slide indicate storm infrastructure existing. And the numbers next to the orange represents the elevation of the storm structures. And you can see at 2.0, there's flooding in a few areas, but not significant. Go to the next slide. Next slide will show the yellow areas that would need to be raised. These are the low-lying areas. And then the next slide would show the more major flooding, which would encompass more of the roadways, or almost all of them. The next slide. This is Glenwood Place. Again, at an elevation 2. You've got flooding at the bend in the road there. I believe the portion that goes towards the river there is it's almost like a boat ramp. I don't know that's what it is, but it really slopes down there and towards the water. Next slide. Next slide, June. And again, this would be at elevation 3.4, which would be more of a major flooding event. Okay, this is Harbor Place. Again, at 2.0, you've got a little bit of flooding, or a little bit of ponding water at Harbor Place at the end, but not impassable. Go to the next slide. So you can see there's very little yellow in those areas. Until you get to 3.4, and then you have a significant amount of flooding at Harbor Place and the end of Harbor Road there. Okay, next slide. This is Island Drive, Island Court. This, yeah, and then you go to the yellow roads, you can see that most of the community is cut off because there's one entrance in. So when that road going over the bridge is flooded, the majority of the homes aren't going to be able to get out. Next slide. And then at 3.4, all of the roadways are flooded. Okay, next slide. This is Sandy Point. Again, you've got a little bit of flooding at the end of Sandy Point Drive. You've got some over to the left. I don't know the name of that street offhand. Go to the next slide and show you the yellow. And all this flooding appears to be coming up through the inlets because it's not connected overland. Doesn't appear to be connected overland to any of the bulkheads. The next slide. And then for an elevation of 3.4, you've got more substantial flooding of the roadways. And this is Swan Point. There's really no drainage in Swan Point except up near, there's a culvert up near the entrance road. The majority of the marsh area is flooded at an elevation of 2. I go to the next slide, we'll show the lower part of Douglas Road and Gale Road. Is that Gale Road? Is underwater or low lying, and the end of Sheldon Avenue. And then again, the next slide will show more substantial. Almost the entire neighborhood is flooded, except for a portion of Cedar Point Avenue. This is Toons Brook. There's quite a bit of, compared to the other neighborhoods, quite a bit of storm sewer in this neighborhood. There's not a lot of complete street flooding. There's a few puddles here and there around the inlets, as you can see on the edges of the road, but still wouldn't be impassable. Next slide. Until you get to the 3.4, which is the next slide, which then shows substantial flooding of Kettle Creek Drive in the end of Toons Brook Drive. This is Van Note Drive. A little bit of water in the possible, it's not even connected hydraulically, so we'll probably just lay there during storm events at an elevation 2. Doesn't appear to be any storm system in this area.
Alyssa, where'd you put the new flapper?
There's a storm drain there. It may not be mapped on the GIS, but there's a storm inlet that travels between the 2 houses at the end.
Oh,
Okay.
that's where it is, between the 2
Yes.
houses at the end?
Yes.
Okay.
Kind of straight up from where that yellow is?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So maybe the yellow is where the inlet is.
That's the one flap. That's our new flapper valve. That was like our trial for
The War Pro.
for the War Pro.
Correct.
Okay,
Been successful.
great. So then when you have the a larger storm event, then you do get the entire cul-de-sac is flooded. So the flapper valve would definitely help prevent that. Okay, so we've looked at all the inundation maps that we prepared, and we came up with the conceptual flood mitigation design approaches. And in the center, on the left side is the site names. In the center is the short-term design approaches. These are to design to an elevation of less than, or should be less than or equal to 2 foot. In these areas, the flood elevation reaches 2 or less, around 2, for approximately 1,500 hours per year. So to offset that and to mitigate those mitigation, the recommended approaches are listed for each community. It's a variety of installed check valves, raising of roads and driveways, raising select bulkheads. Those are the typical recommended mitigation measures for the short-term design. The right-hand column lists long-term design approaches, which would be flood elevations greater than 2 feet. And the flood elevation gets above elevation 2 approximately 60 hours per year. And again, the solutions for these particular cases, again, is to install check valves, raise bulkheads, and in some instances, pump stations where you have significant flooding that can't be, where roads can't be raised high enough due to surrounding properties. So those are the methods that are, and each neighborhood uses a different combination of each of those. If we go to the next slide, we'll see the remaining neighborhoods.
Jeff, you just want to mention about raising the roads and how that impacts my driveway apron?
I'll get to that.
Okay.
It's on the cross-section slides, so it's easier to show there.
Okay.
Is this the second one?
Yes.
So this is basically the same, same categories as the prior slide. Your short term in the middle and your long term on the left-hand side. And the proposed mitigation measures are basically the same. It's just a combination of different things depending upon the severity of the flooding, and also the elevation of the surrounding neighborhood properties and so forth, because you can only raise the road so high before you have to do some other type of mitigation measures. Okay, next slide. Is there a reason it doesn't? There you go. Okay. So this slide shows, is a graphic to show raising roads and how that would mitigate tidal flooding. The blue represents water, obviously. And then the black line between the two homes is the existing road elevation. And you can see that the blue would cross the roadway in this particular example, up onto the property and up over the sidewalk if there was a sidewalk and curb. And that's what's represented on the right. The white area on the right side of the road would be, the vertical would be your curb, and then the white next would be your sidewalk. So in the existing condition, you could have flooding across the entire roadway and covering all those particular areas. By raising the roadway in orange, and conversely the curb and sidewalk, you can see that it's conceptually possible to raise the roadway so that it's out of the flood, so you have access to the properties, and raising a portion of the property, including readjusting the driveways to match into the new road elevation. You could get above the flood elevation. There is still the potential that there would be a small amount of water in the gutter, both either the curb side or the non-curb side, represented by the little bit of water that's in the gutter, above the orange line in this particular example, which is far less than the amount that covered the entire roadway. So what raising roadways does is it improves vehicular access during normal tide events. And this may require driveway, sidewalk, and yard improvements to tie into the new roadway elevations. Stormwater impacts and mitigations and mitigation measures would have to be handled on a case-by-case basis during the final design process. And that would be based upon more accurate field data and design information. This particular method would require neighborhood buy-in, meaning that the property owners would need to, meaning that there would need to be some work done on private properties in order to make the connection between the grade, driveways, et cetera, into the new roadway system. Okay, next slide. This slide shows two pictures that represent two potential scenarios of raising the roads. We'll start with the one on the left. The red outline would be the raised road, with the white representing the change in elevation of the roadway. The blue on the side would represents potential water that may still be in the gutter line. And you can see from this particular picture, instead of the entire roadway being flooded, there could potentially be water still in the gutter. Now, this type of situation would occur in situations where existing dwelling elevations and or garage elevations are so close to the existing roadway that it's not feasible to raise the edge of the road that much. So you're probably still going to have some water in the gutter still. But from tidal flooding, there should be no additional waters pushed onto the property for tidal events. Now, the one on the right shows the same thing, with the red outline being the raised road and the white representing the raise in elevation. In this particular case, we're showing some green on the edge, which would be tying into the adjacent property. In this particular case, we're showing raising the edge of the road as well as the center there to eliminate this all flooding from the properties and the roadway. And again, it's going to depend on the height of the adjacent properties. You can see on the slide on the left, the garage on the right-hand side is fairly close to the existing ground elevation. There's not a lot of rise there. Whereas on the photo on the right, where the white car and the gray truck are, you can tell that driveway sits up, a more substantial distance. So there's more of an opportunity to raise the roadway and make the appropriate tie-ins to the driveways. Okay, next slide. This schematic shows how check valves are intended to work. The top view shows the situation where you've got no check valve. You've got storm sewers or storm inlets on both sides of the road, it says inlets and gutter. And you'll notice that the vertical storm inlets are filled with blue water. The pipe is running to the right, is also full of water. And that goes out through the head wall on the right side. So when the water comes up to the top of the head wall, or top of the bulkhead, the water in the street is going to achieve the same elevation. So the water is going to back up into the pipe and come out the inlets and achieve basically the same elevation as what's in the elevation in the bay. So if you go to the second one, the one below shows the installation of a check valve just before the bulkhead. So in this situation, water can flow out from the street into the bay when the tide recedes, and there's a difference in head between the road side and the bulkhead side. So for instance, if the bulkhead, the water would drop below the pipe or get to the top of the pipe, the water would, like we discussed before, would achieve basically the same elevation. So if it were to drop, say, to the top of the pipe, then there would still be water in the pipe, but it wouldn't be any higher than that. Then as the tide starts to come back in, the check valve is going to close, and then it's not going to let any more water in, even though the bay side of the bulkhead is getting higher than the road elevation. So in this graphic, the white represents open air, if you will, in the inlets, and the blue represents the water in the inlets and the pipe. Next slide. This slide represents, there's a raising and stabilization of shorelines. Some pictures from around the neighborhood that show some bulkheads. You can see in the upper left corner, there's some different heights in the bulkhead. The property looks like it's higher than the end of road bulkhead. The one in the middle sort of has what appears to be a little opening between the stone area there to allow water from the road to drain out, but that also lets water back in. And the same thing with the one on all the way to the right. You can see there's a board missing in the bulkhead there, and that portion of the bulkhead is somewhat decaying. Looks like you might have more of a fiberglass type higher bulkhead to the left of that picture. So these are the type of things that would need to be, repaired and looked at and mitigated so the tide waters can't circumvent the intent of the bulkhead. There's other areas along these particular communities where living shorelines or rock revetments might be, a viable option. It would depend on a case-by-case basis of the data that's collected for these areas to pick the appropriate mitigation method that can be designed and permitted by the state to correct and address these situations.
Right, Jeff, you done?
I think so.
Okay, so let's just go quickly over the next steps. So moving forward, we're going to be updating some additional topographic mapping in specific areas that will enable the project to move towards ultimate final design. The Township and Act will continue to identify some sources of funding. We'll be looking for the Army Corps, as well as FEMA, New Jersey Office of Emergency Management, and NJDOT, which has hopefully more funds available through their local aid program. We're going to be working with the Township to identify and recommend some revisions for future design standards for the Township ordinances, and then working with BRIC in developing strategies, allocating funding, and moving to actual implementation, which leads to then final design, obtaining the necessary permits, and then on to construction in the areas that are going to be moving forward for the Township. So that's our presentation, and then back to you, Joanne. Hello.
Unmute. Did I unmute? Yes, okay.
Yeah, you're on mute.
All right, sorry, I was trying and it wasn't cooperating with me. So Mayor, do you have anything to add?
Just as far as, some people may question about funding. We do an $8.5 million capital budget every single year, which includes, vehicles and buildings and roads and parks and anything that, any big projects, it's called capital. So since I became mayor, we kept that at $8.5 million. So for the time being, it's been always $8.5 million, and that was a debt reduction program. By doing that, I was going to lower the debt in the township $1.5 million per year. And at the end of my first 4 years, that was going to be $6 million. And then obviously I'm in my second term, so it would go up $1.5 million from there. But all the different types of cost cutting and things like that, it's actually up over $40 million, the debt reduction plan. So because of that, and because of the seriousness of this problem, we're actually starting, with the next capital budget, we are going to go from an $8.5 million to a $10 million capital budget. The 8.5 will still be projects and vehicles and parks and all things that needed there. And then that additional $1.5 million will only be used for flood mitigation purposes for what was shown in this presentation, as well as the other neighborhoods. We have 13 neighborhoods total with the flooding problem that's been covered by these by these presentations, and that $1.5 million will go towards that. Plus, some of the other $8.5 million will go towards that. Go towards the flooding issue as well, just as it has over the last many years. That's all I had to.
Okay, terrific. Alyssa, do you have anything?
Okay. I don't have anything, but I would suggest we repeat some of these areas in the Cherry Quay presentation, because they're like the Toonsbrook area is closer to Cherry Quay. I already texted Rob. We're going to talk in the morning at 9 a.m. about kind of repeating some of these areas in the next presentation.
Great.
Okay, that's a good idea, for sure. And that's next week on Tuesday? No, Tuesday's.
Monday, I think.
Monday at 7.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, I can't think of anything else to add. We will certainly, accept questions from residents after this, but this would give them a good benchmark to review and listen to. Certainly some of the folks that had trouble with the technology for the Shore Acres meeting had a chance to do that, and we've gotten some positive feedback. we'll at least have the documented record available. So don't think any of us on our end have any additional questions. Councilman Halloran or Councilman Minikino, did you want to add anything?
No, I don't have anything tonight, Joanne. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Me neither, Joanne. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Well, with that, I suggest we call it an evening.
Well, thank you.
Okay, thanks for the presentation.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thanks again,
Thank you.
everybody.
Good
Thanks
night.
for your time. Have a good night.
Good night.
Be safe.
You too. Bye-bye.
Good night.
Bye.